Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor, moderated by Professor Mike Kaler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by Kroll. Kroll is trusted by companies and compliance officers worldwide to help prevent, detect, and remediate FCPA challenges with scalable end-to-end compliance solutions. From high-volume third-party screening and automated monitoring, to risk-based due diligence, to complex investigations and monitorships. With leading experts, global resources, and advanced technology, Kroll is uniquely positioned to meet all your FCPA needs.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Kaler, and today's guest is Ryan McConnell, the founder of the boutique Houston law firm McConnell Group. Ryan is a former federal prosecutor who focuses his practice on corporate compliance issues, internal investigations, and white-collar criminal defense, including in the FCPA context. Thanks for joining us today, Ryan.
Thanks, Mike.
You recently wrote an article that caught my eye titled, "Watching Which Way the Wind Blows. You Need Good Forecasting to Build Good Compliance." Now, in the article, you note that much like the weather, companies thinking about their compliance programs make forecasts, often in the form of risk assessments, but you argue in the article that many company risk assessments are fundamentally flawed. Can you explain that and, more broadly, the thesis of your article?
Sure. If you look at the way many risk assessments have historically been done at companies that I've heard from at conferences, people I've talked to, they're always looking backwards. The companies, and I think the outside law firms that help a lot of these companies really treat risk assessments like an internal investigation, looking for specific facts that support a historical issue at the company. And really, if you think about it, a risk assessment should be forward-looking. If you think about a program, the risk assessment piece comes before, training, comes before communication, comes before the monitoring, comes before the policies and procedures you want to write. And you really build your program around what risk the company faces. So, if you have risk around the FCPA, you want to know what those specific risks are and then build out your program to address those risks. And the idea that, you should forecast into the future is that you shouldn't just look historically at what risk you've had in the past, but looking, in the growth of the business, potential changes in regulations, in the future, expansion into different markets, what risks are you going to have to address in your company, and then let that drive your program.
Obviously, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is implicated when companies have touch points with foreign officials, and understanding those touch points is very much a forward-looking exercise, as you note. Where do you see your clients having some of the most frequent touch points in terms of this forward-looking exercise that you're talking about?
Well, I think a key part of any compliance program is making sure it's embedded with the business. And if you look at those touch points, the people who are going to be most familiar with how they're going to affect the company, how they're going to affect the risk, are your business guys. Your people out in the markets, the people who deal with customs, the people who deal with the foreign officials, both in terms of, dealing with state-owned company client-type people and dealing with service-type people, the customs brokers, the visa providers, and those sorts of folks. And so really to figure that out, where you're going to have those touch points, you have to engage those business folks and find out, kind of what they're doing in the different markets. And I think that's a fundamental piece of the risk assessment process is talking to those people and then providing them some sort of methodology to rank those different risks. So if you're operating in Mexico and you have a state-owned oil company client, like a Pemex or, a state utility company, state-owned utility company, you'd want to talk to the people in Mexico, find out, is it a joint venture? Is it something where they're directly interacting with those clients? How are they getting work from that client? And then on the service side, what are what are sort of the things that they're doing in the market? Are they getting licenses? Are they bringing things in and out of the country? And then how they're addressing those things. But if you talk to those business folks and really let them be your forecasters, or let them tell you and talk to you about how those touch points will impact their business, impact the business growth, I think you're really going to be able to design a compliance program that better addresses those risks.
Yeah, and all good advice, recognizing, of course, that the same company can have different touch points in different countries, given some unique legal or regulatory requirements in that country. And even more, a company can have different touch points depending upon the different products and services it may offer in a foreign country. Now, in the article, you talk about super forecasters. How can companies become super forecasters when it comes to FCPA compliance, in addition to some of the helpful pointers you've already mentioned?
Well, the idea of super forecasters dates back to this conference that was held at the University of Houston Law Center several years ago. We had this guy, Phil Tetlock, come speak at the conference. And Dr. Tetlock is a renowned expert in forecasting. He set up a team that's competed in a forecasting tournament that's put on by the intelligence community every year. And his team has beat the intelligence agencies and the other schools. And really his methodology, looks at forecasting and people who are going to be forecasters, and really tries to identify biases and identify the people who are good at making particular guesses or particular predictions about different things happening. And he wrote a book. He's written several books, but the most recent one is called Super Forecasting. It's a book with Dan Garner. I recommend everyone read it. But if you apply that in the company context, what you're really looking for is people who have information relevant to whatever those in the FCPA context, to whatever those government official touch points were. And the key thing to be a company that is a super forecaster is really finding the right people and talking to the right people, because you can get a lot of false predictions and false signals from the wrong people. So it's identifying the people who are going to have the most relevant information about those touch points, and people who are going to be able to put that information in some sort of digestible form using a scoring methodology that the company develops, so that the information is actionable for the compliance program.
Yeah, and FCPA compliance, no one's saying it's simple, but, perhaps it's not rocket science either. But I think a lot of times, given the prominence of tone at the top issues, given the prominence of board of director, audit committee, executive issues, I think sometimes, and I'd welcome your comment on this as well, that many of these touch points that often give rise to FCPA scrutiny and risk, given current enforcement theories, they're not C-suite issues. They are issues that face very low-level workers in the global marketplace, customs, licensing, permitting issues. These are not exactly high-level tasks within a company, but that's where the risk is, and you need to cascade your compliance policies and procedures to where the risk is.
Right, and if you talk to people who are good forecasters, people who have knowledge of those particular touch points, they are going to be the business guys on the ground actually doing the work, the country manager, the logistic, the person who's over logistics, the HR people, the person who deals with real estate or licensing. And, it's finding those people to talk to and really getting your hands dirty and finding the right people, talking to them and see how those issues affect their job, affect their business, and how they're implementing the tone at the top, the controls. And I mean, that's really what an effective program is about, is going in markets, talking to people, and making sure it's working correctly.
Now, in your article, given the focus on forecasting, there's some weather analogies. So let's use a weather analogy here, and let's say that a weather person, a meteorologist, correctly predicts the weather forecast 99% of the time. And if there is such a thing, I'm guessing that this person would be a prime candidate for the Meteorologist Hall of Fame. Yet, if a company correctly predicts its FCPA risk 99% of the time, that of course leaves a 1% failure rate. And the DOJ and the SEC will often say then, well, sure, you might have had thousands of third parties, but this particular third party, you didn't get it right. Sure, you may have across your entire company obtained thousands of foreign licenses and permits, but guess what? This one license, this one permit, you got it wrong. So in other words, we reward 99% success in most areas of life, but 99% success when it comes to FCPA compliance means 1% failure. Is that fair for companies to face FCPA enforcement actions given this dynamic? And I'm not suggesting this dynamic is present in all enforcement actions. There have clearly been some egregious enforcement actions where what I just described is not applicable. But you read most enforcement actions, and I think this dynamic is applicable in most enforcement actions. And the question I have for you is this fair?
No, it's not. Going back to your weather analogy, it's interesting because weather forecasters actually have a wet bias. If you look at weather forecasting, they tend to you tend to not want to disappoint people, so their predictions are kind of colored by the how disappointed the viewer or the audience will be by when they turned out to be wrong. Going back to just an aside, but back to compliance, I think the real issue that you're identifying is that it is difficult for companies with compliance programs, even companies with good compliance programs, to identify the impact and the value that program will have on their audience, which is all of their stakeholders, their shareholders, but specifically regulators. If you really do a good job and everything's working well, how effectively do you think the compliance program can try to identify every risk? I mean, that's impossible. Compliance programs, any compliance program, any company will have a compliance failure, whether it's the FCPA, whether it's a health and safety issue, or whether it's a privacy issue. And the best compliance programs are really about, yes, they're trying to prevent those sorts of things. They're trying to detect those sorts of things. They're trying to monitor those sorts of things. But, you want to have a good story to tell a regulator when you do have that failure. Look, we did everything we can, hand over heart, we really couldn't have done anything better, given our resources and our focus on risk. And you really want a regulator to look at the data and look at the information and look at the program and say, yeah, you're right. You didn't, we should have, we should take no action here. You shouldn't have to worry. And I think the issue, they've as you have written, Mike, there's been different incentive programs. There's been all of these sort of, statements at conferences and these other things that, what will happen in given scenarios. But there's really not one standard that companies can look to, or really hard, concrete data that they can look to and say, okay, if we do this, then, that's going to be a defense. That's going to really make sure that we, that we don't get in trouble. And so in terms of that carrot, and people have talked about the UK Bribery Act and that compliance defense. As you know, in here in the U.S., we don't really have that. And I think if we did, and if we had a more concrete way to identify the benefits of compliance and really an effective program that did everything that it could do, then that may encourage more companies to try to really build best-in-class programs.
Yeah, and I've been particularly critical of, the SEC and sometimes its internal control enforcement theories. And, when you know the end result, it was this particular Chinese distributor. It's very easy, with the perfect benefit of hindsight, to work your way backwards and say, you woulda, you coulda, you shoulda done this. And if only you did these things, this would have never happened to begin with. I think that's a very naive, although popular, it seems, way for the SEC to use the internal control provisions. I think even more troubling, we've seen in several FCPA enforcement actions, the SEC using this concept of the company failed to detect and prevent an issue. That's not even the standard articulated in the FCPA. It's all about having reasonable internal controls. And to a point you made earlier, part of having reasonable internal controls is proactively learning of these occasional compliance failures. That's an effective internal control, but do you think the SEC nevertheless views that as being an ineffective internal control and thus in violation of at least the FCPA's internal control provisions?
Yeah, I mean, you'd like them to look at each case on the merits and, look at, the controls as designed and, if they're reasonable and, the company's doing everything they can to decline those cases. I think until you have some sort of standard like you have in the UK Bribery Act, where there's a defense for having those particular provisions, and I know people have talked about it in the U.S. for a long time, then you're going to continue to have those sorts of issues. And I think it's frustrating for companies often because you don't necessarily have consistency in the way these cases are handled. And lack of consistency, drives, kind of inconsistent application of, what a compliance program should be. And, you really want to incentivize having the best-in-class program, and sometimes the, enforcement cases don't do that. Interestingly, on the SEC, if you go back, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years on the SEC, there's a book by a guy, Joel Seligman, which talks about, it's called The Transformation of Wall Street, and it talks about the history of the SEC, and the SEC was set up as a rulemaking body. Enforcement was never the primary concern of the SEC. It was designed to, protect investors, create transparency in the markets. And, if you look at the history of the SEC, they've had long-standing corporate that they, going back 20, 30 years, they do studies, really figure out the impact of market regulation on some of the things that, the impact of markets on some of the regulations they're doing. A lot of the FCPA work has been kind of, rulemaking through enforcement. You have to figure out kind of what the rule is and what the policy is based on these cases. We did get the guide, which is helpful. But, it doesn't seem that the agency is excited as excited as it has been historically about these, rulemaking and the studies and sort of the original intent of its founding.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And, the key concept, legal concept in the internal controls provision is reasonable. that is a completely standardless standard. And the SEC frequently makes up the standards without 1 ounce of legal authority. The standards just seem to be, well, we're the SEC and you ought to do this. And you didn't. And therefore, you're in violation of, at very least, the FCPA's internal control provisions. You know, you talk about lack of consistency. You talk about, in terms of our 99%, 1% scenario, unfair results. I think as the FCPA approaches its 40th anniversary, this has led to, unfortunately, but not surprisingly, a lot of cynicism about FCPA enforcement. And the reason I say that's unfortunate is the FCPA, yes, it could be improved. And yes, I and many others, it sounds like you as well, have some significant concerns about how it's being enforced. But the actual statute, it's a fundamentally sound, good statute that was passed by Congress for very real and legitimate and practical reasons. Do you find some of this cynicism in the corporate community? And what's your take on that general issue?
I see it. You see it in the corporate community, but I mean, you also see it in juries. I mean, you've written a number of articles and blog posts on how some of these cases have fared at trial, and jurors. I mean, they're smart people. They come from different walks of life, and but when you get 12 people in a room and they have to think about some of the application of these principles, and it seems remote to them, something going on in another country involving two companies and involving gifts, and they're thinking about, well, I'm taking off of work to do this and to decide this case. We've had a couple of cases, as you've written about here in Houston, that either the judges or the juries just haven't liked these cases. And I think that same sentiment pervades, everyone who looks at some of the enforcement. I agree with you that the law is sound. It's a good law, but I think that the SEC has really stepped away from some of the good it could do in terms of being thoughtful about the rulemaking process and the enforcement. No one wants the SEC to do rulemaking by enforcement. And if you look at the DOJ, I mean, the FCPA guide, I think, was a good thing for them to do, but that's not really the department's mission, is to put out something like that. And so, you'd like to see, if they're going to put out a guide, that there is something along the lines of a really robust, long study, getting notice and comments about the way they're going to apply some of these rules and interpret some of these requirements.
Yeah, no, FCPA enforcement sometimes sticks out compared to other areas of law in a number of ways, including the one you just mentioned. So in addition to what sounds like a compliance defense that you and many others, including former DOJ officials, are in favor of, is there anything else that the FCPA enforcement agencies should do to better incentivize that super forecasting concept that you write about in your article?
I think that you've seen that most of these cases now are settled with deferred and non-prosecution agreements, and that's a whole other topic on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and the issues with doing that. But they usually have as an attachment to the deferred prosecution agreement the description of the compliance program, and it's normally a cut and paste sort of effort. And really doesn't describe it in great detail. There are some companies where you've gotten a little bit more meat, but for the most part, it doesn't really talk about kind of what the expectation is. I think what companies could, or what the department and the SEC could do, is really sort of describe in some of these resolutions why these cases are settling the way they are. From a compliance perspective, if that's moving the needle, because you see a lot of, and I see all sorts of compliance programs. I see ones that, probably haven't changed in the last 10 or 15 years. They basically take the sentencing guidelines, put in place the what they think the program should have. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you see compliance programs that use data in real time. What's the expectation? Like, what do they expect you to do? And how do they incentivize people who spend the money to make the investment in the compliance program, to have a forward-looking program, to really try to get it right? What are they doing to incentivize those companies when, you have the 1% or the 10% or whatever it is, when there is an issue? How does that translate into a difference in terms of the way the regulators view the case?
No, all good advice. And what's interesting about those post-enforcement action requirements is, as much as the DOJ and the SEC say one size does not fit all, those attachments are nearly verbatim. They're template documents that are included in nearly every corporate enforcement action. There's no specific tailoring to this particular company or the particular reasons why this particular company resolved an FCPA enforcement action. It's all the same.
Right.
Well, thanks for sharing your insight today with podcast listeners. Today's guest has been Ryan McConnell. He runs a boutique Houston law firm, our McConnell Group, that focuses on FCPA issues as well as other related compliance issues. So thanks for joining us today, Ryan.